Hey everybody, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to cover the section 21.2 on the patterns of unemployment. So let's go ahead and jump into it here. All right, so we've already looked at how economists define and measure unemployment. So we're just going to shift our focus to the various patterns on unemployment. We're going to be looking at historical trends, demographic breakdowns, global comparisons amongst different countries. That's going to help us get a little more complex understanding of this. All right. So by the end of this section, we've got a few learning outcomes. We want to be able to explain the historical patterns of unemployment in the United States, identify some of the trends of unemployment that are based on demographics, and then evaluate global unemployment rates in comparison to the United States. We should know, are we doing better or worse than our peers on the global stage? So let's start by looking at the historical trends in United States unemployment. If we look at this data, there's some clear patterns that are going to emerge. I'm going to show you a graph in the next slide, but first, the unemployment rate, it fluctuates with economic cycles. We kind of know this implicitly, but it just, when you'll see it soon. But we have a lot more of that, what we call short-term unemployment, not as much of that long-term unemployment that we would be really worried about. So our unemployment rate really does fluctuate with economic cycles. It tends to spike during recessions, and just on the flip side, it tends to decrease during our boom cycles. So some big examples, the recession from the 1980s, 2008, during the financial crisis, and most recently, like we discussed earlier, the recession triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and all the shutdowns and everything. That was a lot more complicated. And that recession was very short in time frame. We looked at that in a previous video. But that certainly ended up with a surge in unemployment. It's important, though, you got to remember that despite all these different fluctuations, right, our unemployment rate generally returns to a range of 4 to 6% over time. I said earlier that, around 4.1, 4.2% unemployment, that's actually pretty good. I mean, that's beating the average by quite a bit, I'd say. So generally, we're in that 4 to 6% range. And some unemployment you're always going to have, right? There's always going to be 1, 2, maybe even 3% unemployment. There's always going to be some unemployment. There's a reason why. 4 to 6%, that's our average. So even though we had some big spikes, right, it reached around 10% in the early 1980s and 2009, and in 2020 it got up there, even soaring to 25% during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Right. There is, even with that said, there's no sustained upward or downward trend in the unemployment rate over the long term. So when you take a big picture view, that line, it's not trending up, it's not trending down, it's just flat. There's no trend over a long period of time, okay? That holds true even when you're considering factors like population growth and increased participation of women in the workforce. So now this graph here, it kind of shows you that if you tried to put a trend line on this graph, it's going to be just a straight horizontal trend line. It's not going to go up or down, all right? That graph here visually represents that historical pattern of our unemployment from 1948 after World War II up until 2020. And you can see here, it clearly illustrates those fluctuations that occur with the economic cycles, the spikes during recessions, and the general tendency for the rate to return to that 4 to 6% range over time. And it demonstrates here that lack of long-term trend towards a higher or a lower rate. If you ever want to go and look at this stuff, you can go to the FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Data website, and you can visualize all this. You can tailor the time frame. You can get real down into the details with the numbers. Now, let's break these unemployment rates down by some of the different demographics. We'll start with gender, but we're going to look at a few of these. So historically, women's unemployment was higher than men's up until the 1980s. In recent decades, the rates for men and women have become more similar. They often fluctuate together during economic cycles. That being said, there can be some exceptions to this trend. For example, during the pandemic, that led to more women leaving the workforce than for men. And that disparity really did attribute to some of the COVID-19 disruptions and disproportionately impacted sectors where women are overrepresented, such as in the service and the caregiving industries. I had several employees who, after we did our shutdown, I mentioned this in a previous video, so you need to watch that to understand the context. I had several female employees, women employees with kids, with young kids, and many of them did not come back to work. They just did not come back at all, even after we reopened. I don't think they stayed on unemployment. Maybe they tried to, but we had to report to the unemployment agency that, hey, we offered them the job. They just decided not to take it. We did have to report that. But it was a decision for them that, schools were not reopening, not as fast as businesses. Schools were going virtually. And so who's going to stay home, take care of the kids? Where are you going to put the kids? You can't take them to daycare. The daycares aren't open. And so that fell onto the mother in more cases than not. And so I had many, many, many young women who were, well, I shouldn't say many, many. I had 2 or 3. I had several who just did not return to work. And in the years following the COVID-19 pandemic, almost everyone that I hired was a male. Not all of them, but many of the hires that I had were men. And it was just a reflection that they're staying home with the kids. That was what it was. So that's an unusual scenario because the pandemic was obviously had much bigger social disruptions than just the economy piece, but it's important to consider that gender gap. All right, so this graph here shows some of the data from 1948 to 2020, and it helps this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, provides a visual representation of unemployment rates trends for both men and for women. And you can see here they used to be quite different, with women experiencing higher unemployment, but they converged in recent decades, and now the lines kind of move together with the exception of maybe the pandemic a little bit. Moving on to age groups. That's another way we can look at the demographic differences. So here we see a very clear distinction in unemployment rates. Youth unemployment, those who are 16 to 19 years old and 20 to 24 years old, those two groups, they are consistently experiencing the highest unemployment rate. And that's a lot of factors at play here, right? If you might be in this age group, right? You're just entering into the job market. Young people, they're just starting their career. They have very little experience. They have very little connections. And so it's very difficult for them to find employment in the first place, let alone if they lose their job and now they have to look for another one. They don't have references. They don't have a big resume, right? So it's very difficult for them when they're just entering into the job market. Then there's job matching issues. It takes time for younger workers to find jobs that align with their skills and their interests. And in that older young group, the 20s, their education. And there's also a lot more frequent job changes here. Young people are more likely to explore different job opportunities earlier into their careers, and that can lead to unemployment between different jobs. Middle-aged workers, 25 to 54, my group, typically experience lower unemployment. I mean, these are the prime earning years, right? This is their, they've got some job stability, they've got some experience, they've got a resume, and there's some responsibilities that come with being in this stage of life that makes it where, they're maybe a little more aggressive in getting those jobs, and maybe I'm conjecturing a little bit here. Maybe there's an element where they need that money. And when you're younger, you've got more of a safety net. You've got your family, you've got your parents, maybe, most people. When you're out of the nest per se, you're in your middle age, you kind of lose that safety net, and the pressure is much greater to have economic stability. And so the pressure to find another job very fast, very quickly is much greater. That being said, middle-aged workers, may also have some more savings, and so they can take their time and be a little pickier, right? If it was me, if I lost my job, I'd probably take my time. I'd be a little picky. I might even be willing to move to another place, but not very far, but there is, just generally speaking, there's a lot more stability in that age frame. And then the last group here, older workers tend to have very low unemployment. 55 and older, if they lose their job, they might just choose to retire rather than seeking new employment. And so that means they exit the labor force. That's not particularly uncommon. Here we have a graph from the BLS showing unemployment rates by age group from 1948 to 2020. And so this kind of shows you those patterns that I just discussed, the highest rates for the youngest workers, the decline in unemployment as individuals age. This long-term view kind of shows you how those age demographics really play a significant role in shaping the unemployment trends. So it's if you're in those younger age groups, it gets better. That's the message. It gets better. Okay. Unemployment rates also reveal some persistent disparities when examined by race and by ethnicity. So historically, Black workers have faced the highest unemployment rates, followed by then Hispanic workers, and white workers have consistently had the lowest unemployment rates. So there's progress, in narrowing these gaps. In the next slide, I'll show you the visual, especially since the 1990s. But we still have a big disparity in these demographics. So there are some underlying economic disparities and some structural challenges that continue to impact these different racial and ethnic groups disproportionately. And here you can kind of see that data. It's definitely getting better. If you look at this, goes from 1972 to 2020. Again, this is from the BLS. And it shows you that unemployment rate across those different race and ethnicity groups. And it's noticeable that, all of them tend to experience rises and falls in their unemployment together. So that corresponds to the economic cycles we discussed. However, that there's a clear gap. There's a clear gap in Black and white unemployment rates and Black and Hispanic unemployment rates, right? So we just have to be mindful of that. And again, there's some structural issues underlying that. All right, so then there's another way of looking at this too, which is your educational attainment, right? We can see, and this really gets to people, okay? This is very politically driven to some degree, right? There's a greater social divide in our society right now between people who have some college education and people who do not. And a lot of that is because the economy works better for those who have college degrees. And we see that reflected in the unemployment rate. The economy works better for those who are more educated. It works less well for those who are not well educated. They don't have as much mobility in the job market, and that leads to social divides. And so, this is really, really important. And there's a lot more I could say on this, but I'm just going to stick to my basics here. Okay. So in November 2021, college degree people, 2.3% unemployment. Now I just mentioned the overall unemployment was 4.1%. If the college degree holders are at 2.3%, that's half, right? They are experiencing unemployment at half the rate of the nation, of the average. If that doesn't convince you to get a college degree, I don't know what will. People who have some college without that degree, they have higher unemployment, up to 3.7%, but people who only have a high school diploma with no college education are at 5.2%, and people with not even a high school diploma or a GED are at 5.7% unemployment. They're looking for work and they can't find work. So higher education leads to more stable, higher paying job opportunities, and that leads to lower unemployment rates for those with more education, but it creates two economies. An economy that works for people who have the skills and the education, and an economy that does not work as well for people who are lacking in that department. And so it is what it is. Beyond the demographic factors, we also need to look at unemployment by reasons people become unemployed. So when we look at data from same time frame, November 2021, we can break down that unemployment population into several categories for the reasons. So some of them are new entrants. This is individuals who are entering the workforce for the very first time, accounting for 6.5% of those who are unemployed. Not a very big number, right? But that's you've turned 16, 17, 18 years old and you said, I'm going to go look for a job. And again, how do we know this? Well, we're doing those household surveys, right? That we're doing those household surveys, and that's what's going to tell us this information. But 6.5%, so not a huge part of the marketplace. Then there's those re-entrants, those who are returning to the workforce after some period of absence, 32%. It's a big chunk. People who are returning after a period of absence. So why did they take a period of absence? Well, maybe they took a mental health break. Maybe they had a sufficient savings between jobs, right? We said unemployment was when you were looking in the last 4 weeks. So if they didn't look for a month because they had other things to do with their life and they were, maybe they were being a caregiver, maybe they had children, whatever it may be. It's a big percentage of the population. 12.5% are the people who voluntarily left their last job. So they quit their job voluntarily. They weren't fired. That's important. They just decided, I'm done. I don't like this anymore. I'm going to find something else. So it's a pretty decent chunk. People who are experiencing temporary job loss is 11.8%. And then people who have permanently lost their jobs is 37%. And so that's pretty striking. In terms of those who are job losers, we break them out into those two different categories, the temporary and the permanent. Temporary job loss is typically like seasonal work. So I know I'm going to be working pretty hard between, the summer months because I mow grass. But in the winter months, I'm not mowing grass. Nobody's hiring me. So there's going to be some temporary job loss, but I'm going to go back to that job when the season changes. That's not the same as someone who has permanently lost their job. They have been laid off or fired. And so job losers, temporary or permanent, is almost half of the unemployed population. So there's a significant impact that economic downturns and structural shifts can have on unemployment when we see that. All right, so then we also have to look at it through its duration, the lens of its duration. How long have people been unemployed? How long have they been looking for a job? That's very difficult for some people, right? Depending on their education levels. So people who've been looking for less than 5 weeks is about 1/4 of that total. People who've been looking for 5 to 14 weeks, so somewhere between 1 to 3.5 months, another quarter of the population. 15 to 26 weeks, so 3.5 to 6 months, 17%. And then people who have been looking for over 27 weeks or more than 6 months, 37.7%. So that is long-term unemployment. And the prevalence of long-term unemployment at nearly 38% for being jobless that long, that really should suggest to you that there are some deeper issues at play. And like we already saw, right, education plays a big part of this, right? People who don't have a high school diploma are already much higher percentage of the people who are unemployed. And it's probably more likely that they're also in that over 27 weeks category where they're unable to find a job for 6 months. So that's really difficult. There's a pattern there that says there's significant challenges in job matching and skills gaps, in the pace of economic recovery, perhaps. Maybe automation has become a bigger factor, but this is a troubling sign. We want people who are looking for work to be able to get to a job and as quickly as possible. So it's very important that we look at this by time frame. And for it to be so heavily weighted in the 6+ months category is alarming. All right, so let's broaden our perspective for just a bit. Let's look at international unemployment comparisons. We're focusing on the high-income countries. We can look at some interesting things here. So in the United States, before the pandemic in 2019, we had 3.7% unemployment, which is really good, right? In Japan, we have consistently low unemployment, 2.4% in 2019, but they have very unique labor market dynamics. I mean, in Japan, there is a whole different marketplace there. Let's just leave it at that. In Italy and France, they have higher structural unemployment, 10% and 8.5% respectively. So there's more issues at play there. So it's just important to remember that those direct care comparisons, they can be a little misleading, but it's interesting that there's such a wide gap in how unemployment is revealed in these different countries, who are all high income countries. But some of those challenges, right, when we look at trying to compare them, some of those challenges are based on some statistical differences. So things like variation in how we define unemployment, right? In the United States, I gave you our definition, but other countries might have different definitions. They might have different ways they collect the data, how they interpret the data, who is considered unemployed. So that's part of it. May have differences in the reach of their surveys. Like we said, we do 2 surveys, one at the household level and one at the business level, and we're reaching 60,000 households, 147,000 businesses. It's pretty decent. They may not have the same scope or the same methodology in those countries, so it may reflect some of the accuracy a little differently. And then how often are they collecting that data? There may be some differences, right? Japan's low unemployment rate serves as a pretty good example of this because it's partially attributed to some of the cultural factors, right? They have many workers choosing to exit the labor force rather than be classified as unemployed. And so how are we collecting that data? How often are we collecting that data? Is it based on them looking for work for 4 weeks, or is it based on them looking for work in 8 weeks? How are we defining these metrics? Further, though, in the low-income countries, we have a big portion of the workforce that engages in some informal or subsistence jobs. So in low-income countries, you might not be officially employed. You may not have a employment agreement, a W-2 of tax returns and all that stuff. You might just be doing a lot more of this informal work, this subsistence work, this agricultural type of work, or those kind of things. So those types of employment are really difficult to track and measure, and so it's really more something that we do with developed nations. We don't. It's hard to determine unemployment in a very agrarian, developing society. All right. And then the last slide here, beyond the statistical variations, we also have to recognize there are profound influences in terms of economic and social factors on our unemployment patterns. So structural factors, economic inequality, social policies, unequal access to the labor market, all of that's going to play a big role. Government programs can impact unemployment. High-income countries provide unemployment benefits, like I explained to you with COVID benefits that we had. That support is limited or even non-existent in some low-income countries, and that potentially influences job search behavior and unemployment levels. And then lastly, education and how effective are our labor market policies. Those are linked to stronger labor market participation and lower unemployment. And so we see that right here in West Virginia, right? We have here in West Virginia, we have a combination of one of the worst labor force participation rates out of the 50 states, and we have a combination of the lowest higher education attainment levels. I believe we are last in associate degree attainment, the percentage of the population who have earned a college degree at the associate's level, right? I'm doing my part to change that, all right? And you guys are here with me. So we're doing our part to change that. But there is that link, right? Low labor force participation, low educational attainment. Those go hand in hand. So there are systemic issues even in developed nations like the United States. So that is going to finish out this video. I know this was a long one. In the next section, we're going to cover what causes changes in unemployment over the short run, and then we're going to wrap it up by looking at the long run. All right, I'll see you then.